Commissioners.
Wonderful. Therefore, I guess it looks like we're ready. I would like to call the meeting of the Budget and Business Services Committee to order. Today is March 2nd, 2022. And I'd like to welcome the other committee member, Vice President Lamb, as well as Commissioner Bogus has joined us as well. And our fantastic staff, Deputy Superintendent Lee, Chief Wallace, Director Gordon, and we're also joined by Council Mike Quinn and Board, what's your official title now? But Judson, sorry, I was about to call you Board Liaison, but that's not right. The
Executive
Board,
Assistant, Board of Education.
Board of Education. Thank you, pardon me. The Executive Assistant to the Board of Education, Judson Steele. So thank you all for joining us and welcome as well to the public. We have two agenda items today. One is the sort of meaty item, which is the second interim report and the balancing plan update, which is probably what most folks who are here for. And then we have the standing item of the Budget and Business Services Committee calendar. So I also want to announce that there was some, before we get started, that there was some expectation that the literacy resolution might be coming to this meeting. And I just wanted to make it clear to everybody, if anyone hadn't heard, we're expecting to have it at next month's Budget and Business Services Committee meeting, because there's still work being done and we didn't want to do the fiscal analysis without having had the final version of that. There's also a resolution, there's another resolution, the Samoan Community Development Resolution, which also the budget team is still working on the fiscal analysis for. So those we would expect, I think, to see at next month's committee meeting, in case anyone is wondering. All right, and with that, I will turn it over. Who am I turning it over to? Chief Wallace, you?
Yes, I believe
Wonderful.
so. I think, actually, I think we have, yes, the interim report is up first. We usually do the calendar first, just kind of by chance they got swapped, but I think it's just as well to start with the interim report and then close out with discussion of really next steps of what's coming up down the road with the Budget and Business Services Committee. So good evening, everybody. This item before us is an informational discussion about our fiscal year 2021-22 second interim report, as well as our multi-year projections. On the next slide, just to kind of go over our main objectives with this discussion, part of the interim report review is to examine the trends with our expenditures and our revenues in the current fiscal year, as well in the multi-year projections. So looking 2 years out for fiscal year 2022-23, and then next in fiscal year 23-24. We will discuss the impacts on our balancing plan, and then we'll close out to look at I'm sorry, Ms. Luzon, you're off mute.
Google image of Arcade National.
Sorry, could everybody mute, please?
Thank you. And then we'll close out looking at next steps with regard to our interim reporting. On the next slide, just want to remind everybody of what the interim report process involves. So we always start out the fiscal year with the adopted budget. That happened in June of 2021. The board did adopt the budget for the current fiscal year, and then the state California Department of Education requires school districts to submit 2 interim reports throughout the year. The first interim report was submitted in mid-December, and here we are now in mid-March preparing to submit our second interim. And as described just previously, the purpose of these reports are to describe changes in our budget assumptions. In this particular case, we're having our informational item this evening. I actually do want to break some news that we do have approval from CDE to change the timeline on the adoption of our interim report. We requested that we take the second interim report to the full board on March 22nd, so the second board meeting of this month. And then we will turn around and submit it directly to CDE, likely that evening after we hopefully receive board approval. And the purpose of that shift is because there were changes in our budget balancing plan. And we can discuss it in more detail, but just at the highest level, there was the board did not approve a resolution last night with regard to a group of employees that were a component of our balancing plan. So staff is going to take some more time to make updates to the balancing plan and formalize that within the second interim report. So I'll discuss those in a little bit more detail once we get to that section of the presentation. But just for now, I want to highlight that these dates are shifting to March 22nd for the board review and ultimate submission to CDE. On the next slide, I just want to share an update that the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team, or FHCMAT, has conducted its Fiscal Health Risk Analysis, or FHRA, for both the district and the County Office of Education. This was something that was directed to occur by CDE in their September 2021 letter that the district should engage with FHCMAT to do this work so that they can assess really the fiscal conditions of the district. FHCMAT is prepared to present at the next board meeting on March 8th, but just as a preview, a handful of items that came out of those reports were recommendations that we are trying to incorporate into the second interim report. And 4 of those factors are: 1, clearly articulating the planning factors that drive our multi-year projections. So what are the cost of living adjustments, the inflation rates that we're applying to our expenditures, the per pupil dollar allocations for our average daily attendance. So I'll be providing more of those details. I think I have provided them in the past, but really just want to make sure that they're clear up front in this presentation. Another change is that you'll see slides related to the County Office of Education separately from the district. In the past, we haven't really called out the County Office of Education explicitly. So I'm going to provide some of those details tonight. We do talk a lot about our use of restricted resources to help us balance, and that is something that FHCMAT is encouraging us to do more. So we talk a little bit about that tonight. And then finally, really being clear about our balancing measures for the current and future fiscal year deficits. That's where our balancing plan comes in. So on the next slide, I want to go ahead and give a summary of our planning factors. I won't go into them line by line, but really just want to demonstrate that this is the information that we're using for evaluating our revenues and major expenditures in our budget. As you can see, this is over the 3-year period of the current +2 fiscal years. And some important changes since the time of the first interim really comes down to the cost of living adjustments for the local control funding formula. That previously that COLA had been much lower. We had good news in the governor's January budget of having that increase to 5.33% next fiscal year and 3.61% the following year. Another thing that I might call your eyes to is with regard to enrollment and average daily attendance towards the bottom of the page. Unfortunately, we are seeing declines in our enrollment, and therefore it's important to show declines in our average daily attendance as well. I think previously, we hadn't really articulated that in our presentations, and really just want to have us all keep our eyes on those numbers. One thing that has changed our outlook for the better is our unduplicated pupil percentage. So thinking about low income, foster, other students who need additional support in our district, you can see that we are between 58% and 59% projected in our pupil makeup. On the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and start diving into more of the numbers. So as I said, first with the county, looking at the just overview of looking at all resources, I want to just give an overview that the County Office of Education budget is in good standing this fiscal year, that both unrestricted and restricted revenues and expenditures are in alignment. However, you can see that our local control funding formula actually has been brought down in the second interim report. Previously, the estimate of 11 million hadn't taken into account our declining enrollment and average daily attendance in recent years. And now that we do have those numbers clearly understood, we've now reduced our LCFF. Another area is with our federal revenues. That $1.5 million reduction represents an adjustment in our ESER revenue assumptions. We had overstated what we had in the county office. But on the flip side, we actually have some good news with regard to state revenue, particularly with the Early Educator Effectiveness Block Grant. Taking into account the STRS pension contribution, we hadn't included that revenue, which actually has a matching expense within the County Office of Education. So got a little bit of a mix of good news and bad news with the county office. But all told, you'll see that we do have sufficient funds to cover our economic uncertainty reserve with $2.6 million, as well as an anticipated ending balance of $5.2 million for the end of the fiscal year. And that ending balance does contain some unrestricted revenue, but it's primarily made up of restricted resources, particularly the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant, which we anticipate will spend down over time. Next slide, please. So for our multi-year projections, we did apply the planning factors, and overall, you will see a decline in our revenues, primarily because we're not currently anticipating a STRS pension in-kind contribution. So you can see that like our LCFF gradually increases because of our COLA estimates. Federal revenues just grow slightly, building in an assumption for CPI. But the other state revenue is where those STRS contributions typically occur. But you can see there's a decline from the current year and going into the following 2 years. But even with that decline, we are anticipating that our operating expenses and are within our means within the County Office of Education Fund. So we do maintain our reserves, and you'll see that the restricted balances decline gradually over time, and that's in anticipation of that drawdown from the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant. So on the next slide, we'll go ahead and transition over to the district. There is general good news that first looking at all resources, first we'll talk about all resources and then transition to unrestricted general fund specifically. But overall, our district fund and outlook is positive. We build in the assumptions of federal stimulus funds in the current year, as well as other one-time and ongoing state revenues. So thinking about the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, the Educator Effectiveness Block Grant. Actually, the bulk of those funds do land in the district. And then notably, the local revenue line, you can see, actually I'll show it, you'll see it when we get to the unrestricted side, but that is a significant component, actually $120 million of, actually, excuse me, $150 million of that overall increase in revenues, because it takes into account the parcel tax revenue that we receive as a district as a result of the Proposition G litigation coming out successful for us, but also this outlook, thankfully, reflects the loan forgiveness from the city, the $26.6 million, which I don't have it as a talking point on this slide. I think it's on the next slide, but it's very exciting news that the Board of Supervisors did approve the forgiveness of that loan of ERAF dollars that had been loaned to the school district to help cover our Living Wage for Educators Act expenses while the Proposition G was under litigation. So all of those revenues are assumed in this projection for the current year. For the most part, expenses increased to align with those available revenues, but I do want to highlight some assumptions for setting aside funds in our reserves. So particularly our economic uncertainty reserve is that basic 2% requirement from the state. And then because this is all resources, we're anticipating there would be ending balances in our restricted reserves as well. But new reserves include our rainy day reserve. So anticipating that we would set aside $40 million of the LWA, the parcel tax revenue. The board had committed to setting aside those funds into a rainy day reserve that would only be drawn down in extreme circumstances. And then beyond that, we also have a budget stabilization reserve that is critical in our budget balancing plan. I'll speak to that more shortly, but it's also not only part of the plan, but the $26.6 million that the city has now authorized will provide additional support in the future years as our attendance declines. Next slide, please. So now looking at the unrestricted side, I'm going to try not to repeat myself because a lot of the story I just shared on that overview, now you'll focus in and see it on the unrestricted summary. But again, overall, our outlook is positive because the good news is that we are meeting our reserve requirements from the state. We now have a solid rainy day reserve, and we have budget stabilization reserves to help us in the out years. So I would say that that's all really good news in the current year. Some of the key drivers of this outlook that I'd mentioned before is on the revenue side. Local control funding formula is looking more positive. We're now anticipating FEMA revenue that hadn't been built into this outlook previously. And then, as mentioned, the LWA reimbursements and the loan forgiveness all play major parts in driving up our overall revenue outlook. And then this comes with controlling our expenditures to work within these means. Next slide, please. So now I've been kind of talking about the revenue, but I want to drill in a little bit more so you can really see the makeup of these numbers. So first of all, the local control funding formula for the current year has gone up substantially. And this is simply because we had understated the unduplicated pupil count or percentage in our calculations for LCFF. So this is positive news for the current year and helps support our ability to build up reserves in the current year. Additionally, for the federal revenue, I mentioned FEMA dollars. We have been submitting request for reimbursement to FEMA for COVID-19 testing, for materials and supplies. We did recently find out that we cannot recover from FEMA for contact tracing, so that's another major expense related to COVID-19 response, but we have been able to, we're looking at other resources to cover those expenses, but we are anticipating spending upwards of $11 million in the current year for COVID-19 related expenses that we do anticipate will be recoverable under FEMA. And then for other state revenue, we've seen a modest increase because of the calculation for lottery funding. And then finally, looking at that local revenue, you can see that on the unrestricted side, it grows by $119 million net. That's really related to a $120 million growth because of these LWA or Proposition G income streams, but slightly offset by declining assumptions for other local revenue. So overall, we are seeing our revenues increase by $136.7 million. Next slide, please. So next, drilling down into our expenditures, you can see that we are looking at a net increase of $63.1 million. That's before taking into account the balancing plan. So I do want to call out that new line just before the summary of total UGF expenditures. I've built in an offset within our projections to take into account expenditure shifts onto restricted resources and other current year savings that we're anticipating, such as additional salary savings due to vacancies. So I just want to call that out up front because there's a discrepancy in the description and the table. So the balancing plan is the main driver of that difference. But overall, you can see that there are some shifts in certificated and classified salaries. That's really, I anticipate, due to just changes in actual hiring patterns where we've hired certificated instead of classified. But overall benefits have increased by upwards of $60 million. And that's because we've built in an anticipated one-time $60 million investment in our other post-employment benefits, or our retiree health benefits. And this is one of the planned uses of the Proposition G LWA dollars. We talked at length when we were first planning out the use of these funds. And one of the main components of our planned use of these funds were investing in OPEB and setting aside that $40 million rainy day reserve. So both of those things are, you can kind of see them clearly here in the second interim report. We did make some minor adjustments to our indirect cost recovery assumptions. And then also just want to acknowledge that we started off the year with a $2.5 million reserve for COVID-19 related expenses. We have fully utilized that reserve. So part of why you would see an increase in our non-personnel expenses in particular is due to the application of those funds. But you may recall from the first interim report that there was just generally cleanup that the fiscal staff made midway through the year of the distribution of ESSER dollars. That's actually another major driver of changes in our salaries as well as our non-personnel expenses, was that we had increases in those line items but decreases in our contributions. And that was really just from the realignment of which expenses we put on the ESSER dollars. Next slide, please. So then I just quickly want to touch on these reserves. I mentioned the 40 million rainy day reserve. I think that this is between OPEB and this reserve, these are very significant steps for our district. I just want to say that I am very excited to be able to say that we are using these funds in these ways, that we're between OPEB and making that investment that will significantly drive down our liabilities for our retiree health benefits. And then having a rainy day reserve available are both critical for the long-term fiscal sustainability of our district. So just want to celebrate that. And then furthermore, looking at our budget stabilization reserves, the fact that we are setting aside sufficient funds to help with those out year budget deficits. And now we were already planning to do that, but now we have the addition of the city's loan forgiveness, that 26.6 million. I wanted to go ahead and call that out, particularly because it's new. I didn't want to roll it up into that general budget stabilization reserve. You'll see that in the multi-year projections as well. Next slide, please. So then going into the multi-year projections, again, applied the planning factors related to LCFF, the cost of living adjustment, CPI, the funding per pupil, and then just recognizing that we had previously had deficit projections of $125 million for the first fiscal year, the 22-23 projection, and then 40 million for fiscal year 23-24. You'll see here actually that this projection has us balanced of addressing those shortfalls. And that's a combination of our revenue outlook, so building in some of the assumptions from the balancing plan are incorporated into that revenue outlook. And then additionally, on the expenditure side, you can see that there's a buildup of these savings assumptions from the balancing plan. And I just want to call out that for fiscal year 21-22, that negative 21 is really, that's part of the, even though it's shown as an expenditure, that's anticipating savings that's necessary to build up our fund balance that then serves as a source in those following fiscal years. So there's a little bit of a food chain with regard to money going from being an expenditure or a savings in your expenditures. You're setting those funds aside and then they become a funding source. And then just notably, as folks might recall from prior budget presentations, we were able to highlight a $40 million improvement in our revenue outlook because of the governor's January budget projections for local control funding formula and special education revenue. So all of those things are built into this overview for our multi-year projections. Next slide, please. I just want to take a snapshot peek and look at our balancing plan. This is a little bit of a different view, but I thought this was an easier way to absorb the information. You'll recall that when the board adopted the balancing plan, we had $50 million proposed in reductions for site-based budgets, then 40 million for central, and then that was a total expenditure reduction of 90 million, and then we had $35 million of sources. The updated balancing plan takes into account some of the changes that I discussed, primarily that we are seeing a $40 million improvement in our revenues. So actually starting at the bottom for our new sources, those sources increased from 35 million to 75 million. So a $40 million improvement. We're able to take that $40 million and restore those funds to primarily to site-based budgets. and then to central. And I apologize, actually, I'm capturing, sorry, a typo there. The change for the site-based budgets was $35 million. I apologize that was a $35 million improvement to site-based budgets and a $5 million improvement to direct services. So this is a snapshot in time of looking at particularly that $40 million improvement and being able to take those new revenues and then restore funding, particularly to site-based budgets and to central budgets. But I do want to highlight that we are underway with our work for budget development. Now we're getting into the specifics, particularly, at the sites. We have our school site councils are now doing their work of allocating their resources. And then central budgets, the divisions are doing the work of identifying exactly, making sure that this plan is implemented, put into place, and we are continuing to look for additional areas for not only for savings, but also potential new revenue. So I think that I just want to highlight that this is a snapshot in time to show that we've done the work to understand how we would balance the budget. But as we go forward with budget development, ultimately, the budget that's put forward to the Board of Education in the May and June timeframe will have more specifics and may have some adjustments based upon information of as staff are going into more detail on their budget. And notably, this is where the change with regard to paraeducators comes into play also, that staff will need to examine the balancing plan to understand how that change will be implemented in this, basically in this table. So I think this is an important informational to give that foundation of changes overall resulting from updated revenue and expenditure projections. But when we come forward for approval to the board meeting on March 22nd, there will be updates to this plan, this particular table. Next slide, please. So finally, getting towards the end, thank you for bearing with me. Just want to remind everybody that interim reports must be certified by the superintendent for districts and counties, and there are 3 possible certifications. Clearly, every district wants to be in a positive certification. We're in very strong footing of having a balanced budget, not only in the current fiscal year, but in the following 2 years. Qualified means that there's less certainty that we will be able to balance the budget for ourselves. And then, of course, a negative certification means that we would need to seek support from the state. We are still waiting to hear back from the state with regard to the first interim, but we did submit a positive certification for our first interim. And the proposal that will be coming forward for the second interim will also be positive. Next slide, please. And sorry, I realized that there are a couple details on here. The main point, we don't need to cover those old details. The main point is that we are looking at a positive certification for our second interim report. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Chief Wallace. I just want to say before we go any further, I really appreciate the continual process of increasing transparency and clarity around this budget, very complex budget materials, but I think I, for one, have really noticed those improvements. And for example, the county and district split, I think was really, really helpful. I think the way you laid out these slides this time are even better than last time, which were better than the time before. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I just want to say, I think this is getting higher and higher quality, and I just want to really appreciate that. I think it really helps us as board members and the public as well to understand what's going on. So And also, just before we go any further, just saying thank you for the work. I mean, we're in such a better place than we were in December. So let's do clarifying questions and then public comment. I'm following the example of my predecessor on this committee, who was brilliant. Because I think it really is, this material is so complex. I think it's helpful to get clarifying questions out of the way right before we do public comment, and then we'll hear from the public, and then we will have a more substantive discussion. So clarifying questions from my colleagues. Let's start with Vice President Lamb and then Commissioner Bogus.
Thank you. And thank you to Chair Alexander, as well as to the budget team. And just really appreciate all the intensity and the work that's gone in and continues to be led by the team. I just had a clarifying question, right, just for myself and for the public. So we're looking at projecting for 22-23. Is it a negative budget outlook, or is it because it's inclusive of various reserves that we're setting for ourselves to soften that as part of the budget balancing plan? I'm sorry.
So the budget balancing plan definitely incorporates that accumulation of savings. So so the budget stabilization reserve, maybe I would say, I don't know if it's possible to take the presentation to slide 13. So I just want to highlight that you can see it's broken out in two places for this budget stabilization reserve, that it starts out at 66.5, goes down to 33.9, and then it zeroes out. That's the intentional savings and then drawdown of those funds. However, the budget stabilization line for the city, you can see, has the 26.6 million and does not draw those funds down. I would say that at this point, we have some comfort in not using those funds, and in extensive conversation with the budget committee, I think that there was consensus that we didn't want to use those funds, that we're ready to make those tough choices, and that to address a structural deficit, you need to either find ongoing sources or ongoing reductions. And so I think it's commendable to leave those funds alone. I think particularly because we don't really know what fiscal year 23-24 is going to look like, right? We know that each year out, it gets murkier. We don't know what the policy is going to be with regard to LCFF. Is it going to stay on ADA? Is it going to shift to enrollment? It's like, there are a lot of things kind of that could shift our outlook. We also don't know how our actual attendance and enrollment trends will be. So I would recommend at this point that we keep those city funds as part of that stabilization reserve, so that we can really see how things land, how the dust settles once we get into fiscal year 22-23. Make sure that all of our assumptions and calculations land correctly. Hopefully they do, and then that will feel like we, maybe we want to use some of those funds, or maybe we're able to leave them alone and build and have that nice security of that additional reserve. I will say that the state is requiring districts to limit our reserves to 10%. So we will want to make sure that we don't, unless we had a way to commit those funds for a particular purpose, then we actually can't accumulate them too much at this point in time.
And again, remind me, so with the accumulation, will we be projecting towards that 10%?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Commissioner Bogus, you're up.
I don't have any clarifying questions.
Okay. Deputy Superintendent Lee, do you have a
Thanks.
clarifying question or a clarifying answer?
I have a clarifying comment, hopefully, and I'm sorry, my timing is off here, and I know this is time for commissioners to ask clarifying questions, but if I may just tack on one sort of footnote to the last part of Chief Wallace's presentation related to the different self-certification options for the second interim report. This presentation was developed and posted, I believe, when would that have been? On Friday, last Friday. And so that was before the meeting last night. So just a teeny footnote on that. And I just wanted to say this just in case it's relevant in the future. We don't know whether it will be or not, but as Chief Wallace said, we're still awaiting CDE's kind of final word about our first interim report. So we self-declared positive at that time. We're waiting to see what CDE says, hopefully soon, about that. And then in light of the adjustments that we need to make, as everybody knows, and as Chief Wallace alluded to, it's great news that we have a little bit more time to look at what those adjustments should be for the second interim report, which will be presented to the full board on March 22nd. But as we do that work, and as we wait to hear from CDE, and as we also kind of get an indication of that their possible take on our adjustments in light of this slight change in plans and our assumptions, I think there is a sliver of a possibility that we may recommend a qualified certification, if for one reason, which is we don't want to self-certify in a way that we know will be at odds with what CDE will conclude for various reasons. So as we kind of do all of that, and as we get more information, and as we talk with CDE, we'll have a much better sense of that, and this will become clear, well before that meeting on the 22nd. But I just wanted to add that little footnote to that last slide.
Great, thank you, Deputy Superintendent Lee, and maybe we can get into that. That sounds like a more substantive conversation if we want to have that in a minute. I do have a quick clarifying question. Well, two around the county budget. One is all of our special education funding now in the county budget, or is it split? How does that work?
It continues to be split. We historically had put most of it in, actually the vast majority of it in the county, and it required us to make a contribution from the district to the county. And so it's like you'd see that contribution and it's like, well, what is that? Like, we talk about direct services and indirect services, like what's a contribution? So we thought that by putting the expenses where the funds actually are, it would help us create more of that tracking of the type of investment that we're making. So now you would see the bulk of those costs in the district, but there's a small component that's in the county because the revenue streams are associated with county offices of education. So we actually can't move them to the district.
Great, that's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify. And then another question on the county. I noticed the reserve for the county was quite large percentage-wise. It was like 2.6 million in a $7.8 million budget or something. Is there what was the thinking on the size of that reserve?
So a component of it is the educator effectiveness block grant. So that's about 2.7 million, I believe. So that's a good part of it. I know that others are truly restricted type expenses. But that is actually something that we're going to continue to look at as we're refining the second interim, that if it looks like there's opportunity to further draw down those funds, we'll follow FCMAT's playbook, although we've always agreed with this playbook. Use those restricted resources. If we can, I anticipate that we may amend the second interim to try to maximize the use of those funds.
Great, thank you. Any other quick clarifying questions before we go to public comment? Okay, seeing none, let's open it up. If you would like to make public comment, please go ahead and raise your hand.
Thank you, Chair Alexander. Seeing about 3 hands so far. How long would you like to give?
Yeah, if we only have 3 hands, let's do 2 minutes each. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hello, Jeff.
Hello, 2 minutes. Wow, that's spaciousness. I
Take your
appreciate all
time,
the work
exactly.
done to explain the many details of the budget. One thing stands out to me though. Can you explain the apparent discrepancy between K-8 and high school funding and spending? On slide 5, it looks like we received nearly twice as much per daily attendance for the state per high school student as we do per K-8 student. Annualized, it looks like we receive about 11,000 per high school student and about 6,000 per K-8 student. Yet our spending per high school student is lower than our spending per of K-8 student. This year, our budgeted spend for high school students is about 6,500, and for K-8, it's about 6,800. I would appreciate it if you could explain this apparent discrepancy. I understand the rules. You can't answer me directly, but maybe you guys can talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Matt.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Matt Kellerman. I'm a parent and a school site member at Ruth Asawa High School of the Arts. And in ancient times, I worked at the school district. I'm calling tonight in a way I don't usually call, which is to express some frustration at the board's vote last night to move forward with potential teacher layoffs, but to protect potential paraprofessional layoffs. I get why the board majority did what you did. You wanted to put a stake in the ground that the district has to be serious about making central office reductions. And you couldn't reject the potential teacher layoffs because it would have been impossible to find savings elsewhere in such a short time. But it's just not responsible governance. And I have 2 reasons for saying that. One, we're facing a non-trivial risk of state takeover. And I've heard the superintendent warn on numerous occasions of the bad consequences of that. And you just heard a few moments ago, Deputy Superintendent Lee say that we may actually change how we communicate to the state about our certification because of that decision last night. Taking a tool for balancing off the table so soon before the second interim report is due is dangerous. Second, I think your actions really contradict the board's longstanding commitment to site-based decision-making. What if the budget situation changes enough for a school to save or even add teaching positions, but now we can't because these para positions have been prioritized? The net result of your actions is that school sites will have even less flexibility to deal with budget cuts because certain job classifications are being protected. That's just not student-centered. None of us want cuts, and you're right to demand that the superintendent and staff look deeper for central office cuts, but the tactics don't represent good governance. Please do better.
Thank you. Hello, Diana.
Hi, my name is Diana Sanchez. I work at Coleman Advocates for Children and Youth. And my one comment is that I just want to make sure that we're communicating very well with parents and students about where these cuts will be made and how these cuts will affect them and their education. And so that they can be better prepare for what's to come. And then also for there to be an opportunity to make their voices and stances heard and put into for input. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Alexander, that concludes public comment.
Thank you so much to the commenters and to you, Mr. Steele. So let's open it up, colleagues. What sort of discussion or other questions or comments do we have to make? Go ahead, Vice President Lam.
Thank you. My question was related to the student enrollment projections. If the team can talk a bit about what is our approach right now around student enrollment projections. Is it new technology we're using? What are some of the milestones of when we adjust to our student enrollment, just for the public as well to understand, and how does that affect our planning once we've passed a budget, and then how do we adjust accordingly? Hope that's clear. And I think I'm mostly honing in on the multi-year projections of that decrease in student enrollment, particularly of my concern.
So I actually want to say the enrollment projections are developed by our policy and operations team that looks at our student placements and looks at enrollment trends. They're much more involved in the deep analytical work that goes into looking at those trends and evaluating where they think we're headed. So you might recall that the last time staff gave an enrollment update, it was a interdisciplinary team, various departments spoke. And so I and business services don't take credit in developing these enrollment projections. I'm simply sharing their projections. But using that information, and so I actually want to suggest that Deputy Superintendent Lee may have some additional comments to add to that. But I just want to share real quickly that we do try to look at prior trends on average daily attendance relative to enrollment to develop those estimates around ADA. I do know that some of the work that's right around the corner for us is to work as a team to build some real systems in building out those projections. Young, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I can add just a teeny bit, and maybe Vice President Lamb, if I could just see if I understood one aspect of your question. Were you asking specifically about the assumptions that are embedded within these multi-year projections, or were you also kind of alluding to a policy question that's sort of pending, or explanation of the current approach to LCFF revenue projections based on state law, or I'm sorry, anticipated state law based on the governor's January budget? I'm just trying to parse out, are you focusing on like what are our ADA projections, or are you also talking about state legislation about ADA?
It's more about as a system,
Okay.
I think, and sorry to kind of jump in here, but when I look at the numbers, and I was pretty vocal about it, I feel like every night, especially last night, if we look at the projections right now of up to 23, 24, it is now then a decade of decreased student enrollment. And so I just wanted to affirm, how are we building into those assumptions?
Yes.
Deputy Superintendent Lee, and like how close are we, right? Or do we anticipate that projections are projections? And I know oftentimes the budget team is like looking into a crystal ball a bit, but it is very alerting to me and continues to be a serious concern of what I hope to stop, slow down the now heading into a projected of a decade of decreased student enrollment.
Okay, thank you, Vice President Lamb. I will just share one, and this is preliminary. I think maybe we could consider this a preview of maybe a future discussion that's sort of similar to the update that was provided last fall around actual enrollment for this year, for school year 21-22. So that work, that cross-departmental team that Chief Wallace mentioned, we do meet regularly on a monthly basis, and we have been looking at the information both based on our current actual enrollment and the numbers of our applications for next year. And as of the fall, we had anticipated a slight continued decrease in enrollment for next year, for school year 22-23, not as steep as the drop-off that we experienced during the course of last year and going into this year. But this is, I don't want to raise hopes prematurely, but looking at the counts of applications through the round one deadline, we're slightly encouraged that the numbers seem to be holding up, at least on that metric. Now, of course, applications don't mean, don't necessarily translate into actual enrollment in the fall, but to the extent it is another data point and a proxy that gives us an indication, we were encouraged, I'll put it that way, that the numbers of applications seem to compare reasonably well with the applications, the same data points from last year, this time last year. So this probably is, and we talked about this in our group actually, when and how to propose making a report to either the Budget and Business Services Committee or the full board, or somehow sharing information as we get more final tallies of all the application data with the board. So you've gotten a sneak preview out of me, but we're looking forward to presenting that more comprehensively.
Great, and thank you. And I think I mentioned it last night as well. I do, as we schedule that for future discussion presentation, to really also disaggregate between elementary and secondary, middle and high. I really want to do deep dives to understand around the enrollment projections, and then the opportunities of where we think investments or funding, so not only so that we can not have a quote permanent loss of students leaving our system, because we know once secondary particularly is very difficult to kind of quote have families return, those students return. So just wanted to note that. Thank you.
Vice President Lamb, can I just add onto that point?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, Deputy Superintendent, when we do that report, if to the extent that we have this information, it'd be really good to know how much of the enrollment fluctuations are due to changing demographics in the city, right? Are people, and I don't know how much we have the sense of this, but I heard certainly a lot of anecdotal data, for example, that a lot of immigrant families that have been employed in restaurant jobs and other service jobs left during the pandemic because those jobs disappeared. It would just be good to know, because I think sometimes there's also this, in other cases, families may be more privileged families may be choosing private school, for example. So like, which of these types of trends, and there may be others, those were just two examples, right? Which of these types of trends are driving this? Because I think sometimes we have this conversation around enrollment as if it's like, if it's the responsibility of the quality of the school system, and obviously that is a driver of enrollment, but there's all these other factors as well. So I just want to make sure that there's that context as well. And thinking about the statewide context, how do we compare to the state in terms of public school enrollment? Again, that doesn't, it may still be declining, and we may still have to deal with a declining enrollment environment, which means we've got to reduce our budget. But I think it's just helpful to have some understanding of the reason why.
Yes, Chair
Go ahead.
Alexander, I wanted to
continue.
I totally agree. And I think, the planning, and I know we have our own demographers, but I know that the city planning department has a pretty extensive, and I know that we've worked in partnership with them. So be curious, right, to kind of understand that the city is also having to adapt. An example we've been hearing about, return to office, right, return to work, and the incentives that that the city is trying to offer, and bringing the workforce back into downtown, or also it does have an effect, I think, to the families and children in public schools. And I think another layer, totally agree about the statewide trends, is also another helpful context. So thank you.
So let's go to Commissioner Bogus.
Thank you. I also was curious if we have the enrollment projections out past the years that are shown, and like, are we kind of projecting out declining enrollment past the years that are shown as well? Because I guess I asked that to say, what kind of planning has been started kind of internally, or do we kind of need to do at the board level if we are projecting that our enrollment is going to be down around 45,000 students versus 57. And I feel like we've kind of talked about how we're gauging it, but I also know that we're in the process of getting ready to open up a new school. And so I'm trying to, I think, figure out how that jives in with kind of everything that we're doing and how we're planning. I know that within the conversations around the mission-based school, there's actually some different projections around enrollment that are being used that kind of show potential growth in enrollment for students, but potentially for that site. And so I think I'm just trying to understand how kind of the budget deficit, the budget decreasing and the student size decreasing and services decreasing to match it, matches up with kind of both our future planning and the planning around existing resolutions and policies, including the new school that's being built and the educational hub, if that is not too much of things for one question.
Should I can try to speak to some of that. So one of your questions, Commissioner, I believe, was about sort of long-term projections, right? And I will say that has been part of that's been one of the questions we've been looking at in our staff working group, looking at the size of each cohort and making certain assumptions about as the cohorts move up through the grade spans, and based on some assumptions about retaining enrollment from cohort to cohort, and the size of incoming cohorts, and the size of our classes that would graduate. That has been part of our staff work. I noticed that when we presented, I looked up the presentation that we made in the fall. It was October 12th in a regular board meeting. If any commissioner wants to look up the content of that presentation, I noticed that we did not include that information on that occasion, but we can make a note to try to include that, with appropriate caveats and descriptions of our methodology. We're using the Projection Pro tool that we've started to use in the past year or so for that analysis. From memory, I'm trying to recall. I think we were expecting a couple of years of additional incremental reductions, and then starting to turn back in a positive direction. But as you say, a lot of that depends on macro factors. Commissioner Alexander mentioned those as well. Macro demographic factors, the pace of housing unit is coming online. These are the types of things that our professional demographers would look at every 3 years or so and we will want to re-engage them in this too. I think when we've talked with them over during the pandemic, their advice was, since there was so many dynamic variables happening during the pandemic, that they recommended that we let things settle a little bit before re-engaging a full analytical study of projections. So we can think about the timing on that as well. The specific question about Mission Bay, again, it does seem sort of counterintuitive, especially with our recent enrollment dips. One thing I will say, that the analysis that we've done through various means of looking at the sort of likely student population in that school reflects a real gap in just in terms of geographic availability of a public school option in Mission Bay. So there are hundreds of school-age families, families with school-age children. And in some cases they are attending schools in SFUSD that just don't happen to be real close. And that's projected to increase, because that neighborhood is quite far along in terms of housing development and units coming online, but they're still growing out a bit. And the numbers of school age children in that neighborhood, which is a fairly large part of town that we don't have an option that's nearby. So that's sort of a counterpoint to this larger trend of enrollment decline, that we have a pretty robust sized set of families in a geographic area that really doesn't have a school nearby.
No, I appreciate the clarity of that. A lot of that being centered around growth from new development that would be around that potential new site that it would be able to kind of take advantage of and be an attractive piece. I guess one thing that I'm also curious about is, I guess from a budgetary analysis, knowing that we're going to be moving to a zone model for our elementary schools. And at least in my mind, a part of that process would include additional supports to ensure that the zones were equitable, since they kind of have to be geographically based, and we kind of have a balance between kind of the west side and the east side of the city. And so I guess just how much flexibility do you see for us to do things kind of to support schools to kind of enter into these new zone models? Or should we kind of assume that our financial outlook right now says that the zones need to kind of be reflective of what we see now, and we shouldn't be able to expect to kind of do much like tinkering to realign things, if that makes sense to you?
And when you say tinkering, Commissioner, you're talking about in the distribution of financial resources?
Financial resources, programs, supports. Just so we can make sure things are equitable in each of the zones.
Right. Yes, big question. I guess all I would note is, for the time being, is that we've definitely registered those discussions that actually you and Vice President Lamb have engaged in at the Ad Hoc Committee on Student Assignment. They're important questions. It's stimulated some of our staff's thoughts as well. It definitely wouldn't recommend presuming that there aren't options to pursue those goals. And there are lots of details that need to be figured out, and at the appropriate time, or sort of as visualizations of the different options of maps start to be shared with the ad hoc committee, with members of the public, with the full board, and that's expected to happen over the next several months this spring. I think that's a great question for us all to hold, and to really integrate our long-term budgetary projections and are thinking about allocation of resources with everyone's consideration of the different tangible options for the zones themselves. So I know that sounds really vague. I just wanted to appreciate the question and let you know that the staff teams are really thinking about that. And I just think it's probably good to discuss in future ad hoc committee meetings as well as of this committee.
No, I appreciate that response. I would just say to my fellow commissioners and to board leadership, I think we need to maybe figure out how we want to have a conversation about it and how we prioritize these things that exist kind of in different silos, whether it's the new school, whether it's the new zoning system, or just kind of the shift in the size of our school district to knowing that we'll potentially have to budget for a school district around 45,000 students potentially, and just kind of how much of a shock that could potentially be to kind of everything that we have established and try to do. So I think just us being proactive right now would be really helpful to really get ahead of this and make sure we're not caught off guard or forced into something that hurts our families. Thank you.
Vice President Lamb, did you want to chime
Yeah,
in?
I just wanted to comment on that. And thank you, Commissioner Bogus and Deputy Superintendent Lee, about acknowledging the student assignment, because there is going to be quite a bit of work, with the zones and visualizations and ultimately, with the time frame of right now of approvals of the zones by the end of June. And so I just want to recognize that and that happy to work with you, Commissioner Bogus, and Chair Alexander around, how do we build this into a committee as a whole, or, a broader discussion with the full board? Because what I want to avoid is, we have lots of learnings over the years, and we've heard it time and time again, and how important building, especially now in this moment of rebuilding trust, really communicating clearly with our families, with our students, and our staff around what those implications can be, and that the fact of the first year of implementation as of now is actually 23-24. So it may seem a little bit far off, but it's not that far away at all. So just to acknowledge that, thank you for raising that, and it's certainly top of mind for me as we do that planning in the next couple of months.
I really like that idea too, because I think a lot of these things are integrated. So maybe maybe a committee of the whole is the best way to get at it. But if because it seems like the zone drawing impacts budget decisions, right? As you brought up last night, Vice President Lamb, around, how many schools do we have, right? Is that sustainable? And what's the size of schools, in each zone? And are we offering some larger schools and some smaller schools in each zone, but making sure that it's sustainable from a budgetary perspective? To me, it seems like all those questions really matter, and getting the geography right, so the zones aren't ridiculously shaped or large, and having them be equitable and diverse. That seems like a huge challenge, and I think we do need to, if we're not thinking about all those factors together, we'll address one of them and then get the other ones wrong. So I have a curious follow-up, Deputy Superintendent Lee, on the enrollment question around demographics. Do we right now do any sort of either exit, not interview, but when a family leaves the district, do we ask them why? Or conversely, if they are offered a slot in the enrollment process as a new enrollee and don't accept it, do we ask them why?
By and large, we don't have consistent information about that. I believe Chief O'Keefe is listening in as an attendee, and if so, if I get anything wrong, Orla, please text me. But I don't believe we collect information about new students or applicants that are offered an assignment, which every applicant is, and do not accept it, or in fact accept it but never show up, and that happens too. So I don't believe we have sort of a systematic means of gathering information about those choices. When students leave, we do have some information in some cases that we enter into what's called the leave code. You know, so there is a mechanism for, and you may remember this as from your principal days, Commissioner Alexander, that if a school knows that a student is moving to another and moving out of town, or going to a different choice within San Francisco, and that's known and knowable, like there are ways that can be recorded in Synergy. However, that's not always provided. And my understanding is that we don't systematically, go to great lengths to try to get that information when it isn't sort of otherwise naturally provided.
Yeah, so that might be something to think about if we, again, to get some quicker data rather than, I understand that demographic studies probably need to be done every few years, but just to even have sort of a more current sense of trends. And I would think these days it could be done with something simple like a text survey or something where it's, everyone may not respond, but at least we could ask and get some data from families. So just to throw that out there. I was going to shift topics, but Vice President Lamb, did you have more on this or something else you wanted to bring up?
I wanted just to follow up about the public comment about elementary versus secondary. So I don't know if staff wanted to comment on that about per pupil spending, or I would like to ask staff if you have that information now.
I think the public comment was actually about the block, it wasn't about the LCFF funding, I think, right? I think there was just a little confusing about how it was. Does someone on staff understand the question and want to clarify?
Yeah, Megan, why don't you?
I'm just gonna, I think it would be great for Anne Marie to speak to the question, although as I understood the question, it was about LCFF, the difference of funding per the different grade levels, but you're correct, Commissioner, that that slide doesn't break out LCFF, but.
Right, I think they actually were talking about the mandated block grant thing where it looks like the high school's getting twice as much, but it's not, that's actually not LCFF. Correct. Right, so I think the caller may have been confused. So I was wondering if we could clarify I think the question was sort of what is the mandated block grant and why is it twice high for high schools, and how does that, I would add, how does that differ from LCFF? Because it actually isn't that high schools get twice as much money.
Okay, so to start with explaining what the mandated block grant is, it is an allocation of funds per ADA in those different grades, but the purpose of those funds is to support districts in our ability, helping us fund various mandates. Previously, or actually in some districts, it is possible to opt to be reimbursed for actual costs, but it's a highly burdensome process to receive those funds. So we receive the per ADA allocation as a much cleaner way of receiving that support. Whereas LCFF is a much larger funding stream for us. It is the primary source of funds in the unrestricted general fund. Overall, mandated block grant generates around $2 million. But I think, so that's the difference between the funding sources. But I think it is interesting to show that the funding per ADA is greater. But I think, so I wonder if, Anne Marie, if you want to speak to some of that thinking around the different funding amounts for the different grade levels.
Sure. Yeah, I can provide a little bit of background. And so I have the kind of LCFF weights from, I'm assuming they don't change drastically year to year, but the document that I had readily accessible it's going to be close. I'm not 100% sure if it's like the weights this year, but it's very recent. So for LCFF, where we get a base weight, and then in addition to that base weight per ADA, there are grade span adjustments there are grade span adjustments for kindergarten to 3rd grade and 9th to 12th. So you get the lower grades and then secondary in our LCFF. The grade span adjustment for secondary is actually about double the grade span for K3. So it is a higher kind of, if you consider that kind of like a weight, it is a higher weight for secondary than it is for K3. And then, right, our supplemental and concentration grants are based on our, on English learners, low-income students, and students receiving foster care services. And then concentration is additional funds at a much higher rate based on the fact that we as a district have higher than 55% of our students who are at least one of those 3 populations, or kind of fall into at least one of those 3. We, in our weighted student formula, do some things that are similar to that, but we don't do the exact same thing in our weighted student formula. And that is part of, our discretion as a district in how we build the weighted student formula, how we determine we want to provide funding to schools, like how we want to allocate it. We actually do some things that are quite similar, but right, they aren't identical. So for us, we have the base weight. We actually have a higher K3 weight, which is also intended to support the contracted lower class sizes for K3, right? So we need to provide that supplement at the elementary level to make sure that the smaller class sizes can be supported. We don't have a weight for secondary, but then we also do the, a couple of those different weights based on the LCFF focal populations and a concentration weight. So I think that anecdotally in our weighted student formula, because our high schools are for the most part consistently larger than many of our elementary K-8 and middle schools, in some ways the larger population actually does help with kind of channeling funds to the high school level based on the fact that the base weight is the largest single number for any school for any per pupil allocation. So that's a little bit of a dive into the details. I'm happy to answer clarifying questions, but I think at a high level, there is actually a lot that we do that is in alignment with LCFF, but we have a couple of distinct differences in our weighted student formula.
Thank you so much, Director Gordon. I want to bring us back to a question I think that Vice President Lamb raised earlier around kind of looking at, when we look at slide 13, I don't know, Mr. Steele, if we could put that up there one more time. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what the big picture is, and then also what's going to happen in out years, understanding that it's not, we don't know exactly, but
in just a moment.
So my question, basically the slide 13 was the one of that had the kind of overall multi-year projections. And my question, Chief Wallace, to make sure I'm understanding it, was, so we have a 31 or 33, so a little more than $30 million deficit at first in each of those years that is essentially being covered by $60 million in budget stabilization reserve that we've saved up to now, spread over those 2 years. Is that a correct characterization of what's going on?
Yes, that's right. That they're, part of the revenue summary, I didn't include it in this presentation, but there's the $35 million revenue component of the balancing plan. A substantial portion of that is actually us building up reserves so that the funds are available in the following year. So it is us controlling our costs and setting those funds aside, or or part of it is actually maximizing that use or leveraging the use of restricted resources, right? Like we're gonna shift $3 million a year onto the educator effectiveness block grant, because that grant does allow us to supplant, right? It's not new stuff. We can get credit for the things that we're already doing, and that is going to achieve a savings. That's identified as a source because we have the block grant now, but what it looks like here is actually a savings that we're able to set aside.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you can see it's a little tricky looking at this because you don't think, all right, I've got to save 50, I have to have a $50 million balancing plan. Like actually that's the combination of those savings and the shifts of expenses off of our budget. And then that shows up in the budget stabilization reserve, and we gradually draw that down.
Yeah. So that's really helpful. So, and then if I understand that 24, 25 it gets murkier, as you put it, which I think is a good way to put it. But if things were to continue, we still would have then a roughly $30 million deficit potentially that year that we would then need to figure out how to address. Now, understanding that things will shift one way or the other before then. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, I think we've talked about this, that it would be lovely to have an adopted balancing plan, implement it, and our work is done. But like, I think I should give credit for somebody saying this, but the thing that's always true about multi-year projections is they're always wrong. That's one thing, because you know that something's going to change, but you're not quite sure what. So that's why the state is having us do this work, because they want us to have that outlook. So for one, I know that there are some assumptions in here that are wrong, so we need to be ready for that, and we'll have to continue this work just simply for that reason. But it's true, there continues to be that drop off in those multi-year projections. That 24, 25 outlook, you know, will continue to have that decline. Of course, those expenses that we're cutting now, the savings of those will also carry forward into those following years, so they help address it. That's us taking care of part of that structural deficit. We're aligning our expenses down to be closer to our revenues, but your point is well founded that because we are relying on savings, they're actually technically a one-time source, many of those, and therefore there will be a drop. You know, when we bring the budget forward for fiscal year 22-23, that will include fiscal year 24-25 in that outlook. And so I think the follow on to this conversation will be a discussion around whether or not we're going to reflect some of those city funds to help stabilize. But you know, I highlighted the rainy day reserve and the investment in OPEB as being big wins, but the other path towards fiscal stabilization really is going to be weaning ourselves off of these one-time sources. So yes, great
and
point.
So,
and yes, more conversations to come about how we're going to continue to align.
Yeah, which is great. And I think that also, what it sounds like is we're in a really strong position now to do that work. And we really have 2 fiscal years in order to, in an ideal world, reduce another 30 million of annual spending. If enrollment trends continue, if these things continue, but it gives us time to continue to make those adjustments. Is that right?
Yes, and I would say that it gives us time to pick some strategies. You know, we've talked about enrollment, you know, keeping an eye on it. What are some things we can do to improve it? We've also had great conversations about generating more revenue for our districts. You know, I think that we need to get really serious about some of those. Like, do we want to set a goal for picking a property that might turn into, you know, a revenue stream? I think, you know, we don't have a lot of time. I think I know this is also one of my favorite analogies. We're building that muscle, right, around these conversations around what our priorities are in our budget. And I think we need to get more agile in making these decisions. So I think this is an okay practice run, but I'm hoping that, going into the fall, that we'll be that much tighter on talking about where we need to prioritize our investments, because unfortunately our revenue still continues to stagnate compared to that expenditure growth.
Yeah. Well, I think you've set us up to have that conversation in a really great way. So I just, again, want to thank the team for this work. Commissioner, Vice President Lamb, you had a comment on this?
Thank you. I wanted to acknowledge that our fiscal expert team is here tonight as well. And Pam, just wanted to offer, some space around through this presentation, as you've been deep diving with the team here, anything that you would like to add that we may not have discussed either both last night, hearing from Elliot, or this evening, particularly around this kind of multi-year projection, even though I want to acknowledge that we talk about it being murky, but just any insight there, both for the kind of more short-term. We've talked a lot about short-term, midterm, and longer term.
I think that you've made, great strides in being, putting together what you need to do for your plan to balance your budget. I think that there is quite a bit of work ahead of you. And, as we were looking at this and thinking about 24-25 and using the one-time ending balance component to help offset your shortfall in 22-23 and 23-24, it is going to be, I think, important to go ahead and try and do as much as you can to look ahead for 24-25, just to kind of give you a head start so that you're able to spend more time in looking at what truly needs to be or could be reduced in the future, even if you're not actually moving forward with it, but to just take a look at that and have those discussions and try to give yourself as much time as possible so that you're able to make those decisions and move forward with them. And I think that that's going to be probably your biggest challenge. I mean, obviously you're facing several others this year, but your staff, I know, has been working diligently to put together this information and make sure that we all understand what it is that's being presented. So I think that they're doing a great job, and your questions that you have as board members or commissioners looking at this, and you're asking the right questions about what's going to happen in the future. And that's something that all of us are kind of looking at, and you are not alone in the declining enrollment area that has been going on for pretty much statewide. And unfortunately, it's not something that anybody can really give us a definite answer on what's going to happen, but by monitoring it and trying to get an idea from people who are leaving, if you can, as to where they're going or what's causing that to occur, I think that's going to be important for you also in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Lasson. And can we, Deputy Superintendent Lee.
Sorry, I can't help myself. If I could just make two additional points related to these multi-year forecasts. One is that, and I know this has been discussed in prior meetings, but the expenditure projections here reflect sort of a rather modest set of assumptions about increases in compensation for our employees. So in terms of collective bargaining, for example, so that's something that I think it just bears noting that to the extent those modest cost escalations are exceeded, or that the board seeks to have higher improvements or quicker improvements, then that would increase the pace of expenditure growth. And then just on sort of on a different note, in terms of revenues, always want to put in the front of our minds our opportunities to advocate for additional revenues. Had a great conversation with Commissioner Bogus earlier today, and as the chair of the Rules Policy and Legislation Committee, I know on Monday there's going to be a good discussion about the state budget. And as Commissioners Alexander and Vice President Lamb know from discussions all year long, we have two sort of highlighted priorities in terms of our state level advocacy, which are still very much in play. One is to seek an additional improvement based on surging revenues statewide, to have more funds put into the LCFF that exceed the statutory cost of living adjustment. CSBA and other advocates have definitely been sounding that call as well. And then increasing funding for special education. So the governor included an improvement of $500 million in his January budget. And as you might recall, Commissioners, a letter that Dr. Matthews and superintendents in, I think, 6 other large urban districts put in a request to the governor, a proposal to the governor for a target of $1 billion of increases in funding statewide for special education for next year. And that's still our goal. But now the target is now the legislature in addition to the governor. So to the extent any of those things happen, which we hope they will, we hope to see some improvements in the next few months that would improve the revenue picture as early as FY 22-23.
Those are exciting possibilities. I think, Mr. Steele, we can, oh, great, thanks. You read my mind. So I had one more little thing. I don't know if I'm looking at my colleagues. No, I'm not seeing other things. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the issue around the change based on the vote last night and the certification. I guess I would just ask if it feels like a qualified certification becomes more than a sliver of a possibility that we consider. I don't know whether it would be appropriate to have a special meeting of this committee or just at least have that conversation, because I think I understand that some of my colleagues even here voted the other way on it. I respect, the different approaches on it, but I also think the intention was really clear that it was to reduce upper management and between 15 and 20 positions out of, over 100. And so it doesn't feel like a $3.8 million savings in those areas feels very reasonable and something that's achievable, that wouldn't necessitate sort of saying that we can't meet our obligations, especially when we have these, also the $26 million city reserve that we're not touching. So I guess I just want to say, if that doesn't feel possible, I would like to, I think we should have a further conversation as a board, because that's a pretty significant step. So I would just make that request, but it didn't sound like that was a huge possibility, but I just wanted to mention it since Deputy Superintendent Lee had mentioned it. I don't know if there's other comments or questions before we move on to the calendar item. Okay, thank you. Let's do that. And I know, yeah, so let's go on to the calendar item, because this also includes some important information about school-based budgets that I think folks are going to want to hear.
Okay, yes, let's go ahead. Yeah, we did add one slide at the end of the calendar item that is not typically there, with a little bit more information. But to get us started, we do have our kind of standard overview of the budget and business services meeting agendas, both documenting the topics from prior meetings and also what we anticipate in upcoming meetings. So looking forward to April, we did have here, a preliminary update on LCAP development, since that meeting will come just a few weeks after we are aiming to share a draft of our 22-23 LCAP and the fiscal impact analyses for several board resolutions. On the next slide, we have the overview of the year. And it's hard to believe that it's already March, but I have made some updates here in that top work stream around the LCAP. As a reminder to the public, the School Planning Summit is this Saturday. There will be at least one live session that I will be co-facilitating around school funding. If you're interested in attending a synchronous session to ask questions and learn more about school resourcing. But that is an important kind of benchmark in the school planning process. And we are now planning out the opportunities for engaging educational partners, which is the updated terminology from the CDE around stakeholder engagement. It is now educational partner engagement. So we will be really focusing on that in March and April, so that joint advisory recommendations can be shared at the end of May as the LCAP is being finalized. For budget development, we are also well underway with the process for schools and central office. There is still a lot between now and spring break that I think will be carried out in terms of school planning and the budgeting process. And then from there, we go into a kind of review, analysis and compilation of all of the individual budgets, kind of reconciliation and ensuring that everything is ready to be finalized for presentation to the board later towards the end of the school year. And then we have a few select board meetings as helpful milestones. And on the next slide, this is the new information, recognizing that we are underway with budget development, and we've kind of entered that phase of information about next year starting to come together, right? There is still a lot that is yet to be finalized that we will be able to share more on, again, as we get a little bit further into the spring. But we have started to update the SFUSD budget and LCAP website with some LCAP and budget information for next year. So we do now have available on the website an allocation summary of weighted student formula allocations for schools. This includes one-year enrollment changes, unduplicated pupil percentages, and allocations by resource. So there's a lot of information there. We encourage everyone to take a look. And there is a link to our folders that include specific information about each school site's allocation. So there are some kind of user-friendly PDF documents that can be helpful for looking at all of that information for each school. And we also have posted the supplement to the LCAP annual update, which was presented at the special meeting last Thursday. So over the next few weeks and months, we will be adding more information, including a budget book preview for our school funding exhibits, the draft 22-23 LCAP, among other items. So we're really trying to get information out as early as we can, make it available so that when it all comes together in May and June, it feels like a lot of this information is already, familiar, known, and has given everybody time to really, grapple with it, dig in, and learn from it by the time we get to discussion and approval. So with that, I welcome questions.
Let's first check to see if there's any public comment on this item.
Thank you, Chair Alexander. Please raise your hand if you care to speak to the budget calendar that was just presented. Seeing none.
I'm seeing one now, I think.
Indeed, we are. Thank you.
Let's do a minute.
Okay. You can go ahead, Jeff.
All right, thank you very much for the information. I wish this item had been first in the agenda. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, colleagues, questions, comments, compliments, complaints?
Just a big thank you on the website and information sharing. I mean, it's just really wonderful to see.
Yeah.
You know, we've been talking about it for a bit and just really appreciate the team. I mean, just not only just the heavy lifting and work over the last, it feels like 2+ years, but at least since I've been on the budget and business services. So just a big thanks.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I feel like, and I was mentioning that actually at the beginning of the meeting to the staff. I think that it's been, it's really exciting, and I want to add my gratitude. Commissioner Bogus, anything else before we wrap up? Staff, any final comments?
Just thanks for your time tonight.
Thank
And
you, commissioners.
yeah, thank you
All
to
right.
the public for weighing in.
Thank you, everyone. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Steele and assistant.
Good night.